A very warm welcome to you this evening for the first of our new series of webinars. This evening we are going to be talking about worm control in sheep, and it is the first part of a launch of the new booklet on worm control in sheep. It's been published by the three levy boards, HCC, Quality Meat Scotland and AHDB Beef and Lamb. They will also be doing a podcast and a video throughout the season, but this is the first part of the launch. It's been updated by SCOPS, and we've got Leslie Stubbings to thank for some of the excellent technical updates that we've got in it. Obviously, sheep worm control is quite a big subject, and as part of this booklet, we've got three regional case studies. The case study in Wales was looking at the strategic use of groups 4 and 5. In Scotland, it was looking at targeted selective treatment. And in England, it's been looking at sort of genetic effects and selecting sheep on the basis of their ability to cope with worm burdens. So as a result, we've asked Claire Jones, who's our Stoc Vet Ambassador, a vet in Dolgellau, to tell us a little bit more about how anthelmintic resistance develops and how the use of groups 4 and 5 can help us to tackle that. And we're really pleased today also to have a farmer, Sion Ifans, who beef and sheep farmer in the uplands just outside Machynlleth, who will be telling us basically his approach to worm controlling sheep and the things that he's done and what he's changed in order to improve the worm control on his farm. And I think without any more ado, I'm going to hand over to Claire, who will kick us off with her presentation. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everybody. So yeah, my name is Claire Jones, and I'm a farm vet working in a practice in North Wales in Dolgellau. I've been in practice for about 10 years now, and one of my main passions that I've sort of come into in the last 4 or 5 years has been sort of flock health and sort of health planning, and parasite management is one of the areas I'm particularly interested in. So I'm just going to share my screen so we can start. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see that. And I'm just going to stop my video as well. Right. Okay. So this evening I've been asked to talk about strategic use of anthelmintics in sheep, particularly the use of orange and purple drenches, and how they can help us to manage our worm burdens and our resistance threat on farm. Okay, so without further ado, let's move on. Right, so just to crack off, so what do we actually mean by anthelmintic resistance? So when the product used against a worm population is less than 95% effective, that's basically how we term resistant. So when we dose for the product, we're aiming for 95% of a worm population to be eliminated from a lamb or a ewe's gut. And if we're having less than 95% clearance, that is when we start to see resistance. That means some of the worms are able to get around the drench and survive. So looking at the other way around, this basically means that the wormer leaves more than 5% of the animal's worm burden behind. So there's more than 5% remaining inside the lamb's gut. So how does resistance develop? So there's some key areas that usually are responsible for resistance building up. Underdosing, so this can be, for example, if you've got a gang of lambs and you are just dosing them for the average group weight, so perhaps you're just taking the average of what a group of 50 lambs weighs and dosing them for that, you are going to be missing the top end of that group of lambs, and basically they are going to be getting an underdose. And the reason why this is a problem is essentially, in terms of looking at it from a worm's point of view, is that you're giving them enough dose to essentially knock them off their feet, but you're not giving them enough dose to actually take them out completely. So if anything, you're almost training them to come back stronger. The other way you can also be kind of lured into doing underdosing is if perhaps your drenching equipment is not maintained and serviced. So perhaps your drenching gun has not been calibrated, so you're actually giving a lower dose than you actually think you are. So you might be sort of thinking you're giving 8-10 mils, and actually because it's not been calibrated for a while, you're actually giving slightly less. So again, you could be underdosing them. Using the same products or not rotating your drenches throughout the grazing season. So this essentially sort of started coming about when we first had the first initial drenches. So the white and the yellow class of drench were the first ones to come around for worm control. And, you know, back in the day, unfortunately, because there was no other alternative to worm products, that is essentially the only product that farmers had to use in terms of worm control, so it was used a lot. And I think a lot of farmers are still kind of in that mindset that they're just using the same product throughout the grazing season. So they may have moved on from using sort of white and yellow doses. They might be more onto a clear dose pattern now. But basically, if you're using the same product every time, what you're then doing to that worm is essentially you're hitting them with the same method of attack every time. So a little bit like if someone hits you with the right hook every time, eventually you're going to learn to duck. So it's sort of the same sort of theory with worms, basically. You know, if you don't give them a different method of attack, then they're going to learn to expect it, and they're going to become sort of trained to get around that, basically. So that's another way that resistance can build up. Drenching when it's not necessary or appropriate. So that basically means sort of exposing again these worms to doses when it's not necessarily actually beneficial to be dosing. So some farmers will sort of perhaps fall into the category of dosing on a certain calendar date in the year, just because that's when it fits in best with their regime. And unfortunately, that might mean it's not quite coordinated with when the biggest pasture burden risk is there and when the lambs actually need a dose. You're exposing these worms when they don't need to be exposed, essentially. And blanket dosing is another one as well. So this basically means when you dose a gang of lambs or a gang of ewes, animals, and you're dosing the entire population rather than leaving a certain amount undosed. And essentially what that means is that all the worms in the guts of those animals are getting exposed to the dose, and you're not leaving any sort of unexposed. And we'll go on to explain why this is important in a minute. Okay, so anthelmintic resistance. So I just wanted to sort of explain a little bit about what we mean by refugia population and population within grazing animals, because it's important to explain what those different populations of worms are, because that basically then sort of has a key play in how we describe and sort of manage resistance. So your refugia population is basically your untreated worms. So that's your worms on the pasture or worms in untreated animals. So worms you're not planning on targeting in a drench. So perhaps they'll be in your rams or your ewes or something if we're talking about dosing your lambs. And the reason that it's important to sort of remember about this population of worms, as I say, is because everything we do with our population of worms within our grazing animals that we're treating will have a knock-on effect on the pasture population, which I think a good example of why this is important is a lot of farmers sort of fall into the trap of thinking, well, it doesn't actually matter what I treat my lambs with because they're going off at the end of the season. But unfortunately, it's the pasture population that's going to be remaining behind, and that's what we're trying to protect because that's what's going to be with your farm long term. So then we've got the refugia population, and then we've got the population of worms within grazing animals. And that's basically what it says on the tin, is the worms within your grazing animals. And as I said, how we treat the grazing animals worms population with the drenches that we use will have a knock-on effect on the pasture population. And we'll explain a bit more about why that happens in a minute. So if we're not treating our animals with appropriate drenches and using them responsibly and using the correct dosing principles, we are going to cause a problem on a knock-on effect on the pasture population of worms as well. So we need to do everything we can to try and minimise the effect of resistance building up on pasture. So just to kind of explain how resistance actually builds up, we need to understand a little bit about the worm's life cycle. And this can be quite confusing, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail. I just want to sort of lay out some basics because it helps us to explain how resistance builds up over time on a pasture. So every time you drench your sheep or your lambs, a proportion of resistant worms will get left behind in the gut. So even if it's a dose like an orange or a purple dose that you haven't used before on farm, they're never going to have a 100% kill rate of the worms on the guts in the lambs. So you're always going to get a small proportion of worms left behind. And equally, if you've got resistance to your yellow, clear or white doses, if there's resistance to those, you're going to leave behind a proportion of worms untreated in the gut of the animals. These resistant worms inside the guts then lay eggs, which are then shed out onto the pasture in the sheep poo. And these eggs then hatch into larvae, so little baby worms, if you like, and they then migrate on the pasture to the end of the grass stems, and they're then re-eaten by grazing animals. And those little immature baby worms basically then grow up into adult worms inside the animal's guts, and then they start laying eggs again. So it sort of completes the cycle. So if a resistant worm meets another resistant worm, they will basically only produce resistant worm eggs, which is important when we talk about timing of giving our doses. So basically all our drenching strategies are basically aimed at trying to stop resistant worm egg population, but also to minimise the chance of resistant worms meeting on pasture and producing resistant worm eggs. And so we're basically aiming to try and dilute out the number of resistant worm eggs on pasture. So how significant is resistance? So across the UK, there's now unfortunately significant levels of resistance to the most common drenches that have been available previously. So you've got your white, yellow and your clear doses, and these are the ones that have been around for years. And in 2014, HCC actually commissioned a project which looked into the level of resistance that was actually across Wales on some of the farms that participated in the study. And it was pretty shocking to see that it was 94% of those farms that took part had some level of resistance to white dose, 68% of those farms had some resistance to yellow dose, and 51% had some resistance to clear dose. And 28% of those farms actually showed resistance to all three classes of drench. And resistance is not an all or nothing thing. So when we say that they have some level, they're showing off some level of resistance, it doesn't mean that the drench isn't working at all on farm. It just means that there is a proportion of worms that are not being treated by those drenches when we use them. So thinking back to that 95% clearance, it just basically means that we're getting a suboptimal amount of clearance after using the doses. So you won't actually necessarily see the effect of resistance until you've got quite a significant problem. And unfortunately, once resistance is then on your farm, unfortunately, it's not going to go away. It's not something that you can take back. And as I said, by selling on that crop of lambs, you're not going to get that resistance problem gone, because it's the pasture population, that refugia population we were referring to earlier, are the ones where the resistance maintains and will be with you for years to come, basically. And knowledge is key in this. It's this kind of, as I said, as this graph indicates quite nicely, you've got your performance, sheep performance up the side here, and your level of resistance here. So this is where you've got your 5%, or only 5% of the worms are remaining in the gut. So this is where your drench is performing perfectly and as well as it could be. Your sheep performance is high, and you're not going to be seeing obviously any clinical signs because you've got an ideal amount of clearance from your drench. In this yellow amber zone here, in the middle section here, you've got sort of resistance is starting to build up, and your sheep performance is starting to go down, but you're not necessarily going to see actual clinical signs from that. So you're not going to be seeing lambs that are going to be looking like they haven't responded to the dose, that you're not going to be seeing poor growth rates or sort of messy bottoms after dosing. You're not actually going to be seeing those actual clinical signs until you sort of start approaching the end of this amber zone and go into the red zone. And once you're in the red zone, you are going to be seeing, so once you get sort of between sort of 30 to 40% of the worms inside the gut still remaining after a dose, you're going to be seeing, actual physical signs. And unfortunately, once you get into this stage, there isn't really a lot you can actually do about sort of trying to sort of control the effect and the development of resistance, because once you've got that level of resistance where you've got obvious problems, that drench is going to be very ineffective on your farm, and probably it's not something you're going to be able to use long term. So it's really important to know whereabouts you stand in terms of your resistance levels to white, yellow and clear doses, the ones we've been using for the last few years much more commonly. And this is something that you can work with your vet to do. You can do something called drench resistance testing. So basically it's fecal egg reduction testing, which your vet can give you more information on, but basically what it does is it's very cheap and it's very effective and it's very easy, and we can basically help you to work out whether or not your sheep are actually responding to the doses you're giving just by doing some fecal samples and sort of monitoring and measuring the response of a gang of lambs to the drench by looking again at their fecal egg counts, basically. So it's something that your vet can help you do to work out the level of resistance you have on farm. And I say knowledge is key in terms of trying to work your way forward and sort of minimise your problems on farm. So how can we actually stop resistance building up on farms? There are things we can do to help slow the rate of growth of resistance. As I say, it's not something you can reverse, but there's certainly something you can manage. So strategic drenching, so only drenching when you actually need to drench, and this can be determined through a mixture of fecal egg counting and weighing and monitoring daily live weight gain. So if you're starting to see that their daily live weight gain is going down, or their fecal sample is starting to show that you've got worm eggs sort of rising above the level you're seeing clinical signs, then this is obviously when you want to be drenching. And that kind of just goes back to saying, you don't want to be drenching on a date rather than when you're actually looking at when those lambs need a dose. So always ensuring you're giving the correct dose. And as I say, this goes back to not making sure that you're not underdosing. So making sure that your equipment is maintained and calibrated so that you're definitely giving the correct dose. Leaving a certain percentage of the group untreated. So as I say, what this does is it basically means that you're not exposing all of the population of worms inside the lamb's guts to a dose. So you're potentially leaving more unresistant worms or non-resistant worms that are going to go shed onto the pasture. So you're diluting out the effect of resistant worm eggs on the pasture by allowing some of the population to remain untreated. So what we mean by this is sort of taking off the top 5 to 10% of your lambs. So weighing them, making sure that you're leaving the best lambs. So obviously you want to make sure you do dose the ones that need a dose, but the ones that are certainly in the top sort of 5 to 10% and that are nearing perhaps finishing weight, you don't want to be dosing those. If you can get away with it, because ideally, as I say, you want to make sure you leave some of the population of worms unexposed to those doses. So rotating your drenches. So this is something you can do with your vet. It's ideal really to work with your Stoc Plus vet or your vet at your practice to try to come up with a tailor-made drenching policy for your farm, which will obviously change year after year, because as I say, we can't advise sort of a very structured plan, because every year the weather conditions are going to be different. I mean, look at this year. I mean, we're in the middle of a very, very dry month, which is quite unusual really for this time of year in Wales. So especially at lambing time, we're usually sort of up to our ankles in water if it's lambing time. So it's something that will vary every year, and it's something that will be kind of adapted every year. But what your vet can do is give you some sort of basic policies as to what to follow as a sort of drench pattern, and then help you try to put sort of steps in place to work out when you need to dose, or at least when you need to check to see whether your lambs need dosing. And the last way as well that we can help try to control the level of resistance that's building up on pasture is through the strategic use of orange and purple drenches, which is what we're mainly focusing on our talk tonight. So this is using these these orange and purple drench classes as part of that strategic dosing to try to help minimise the chances of resistance building up on pasture. So these classes of drench are basically the latest to be developed. So we're kind of steering away from trying to say that they're new, because actually they came out 10 years ago, which is actually important when you think about it, because a lot of farmers might sort of think, well, it doesn't matter because I'm sure they're going to bring out some new classes of dose in the future, and I'll be able to use those. It's been 10 years since we had the last new dose, if you like. So these things are not quick. They are not sort of something you can churn out year after year. They take a long time to sort of put together and get into production. So it's not something, when we're talking about preserving these new or these latest classes of drench, it's very important that we do look after them, and we do sort of are wise with them. We don't abuse them in the same way that the older classes of drench have been done in the past. So you have to be very careful when we use these doses and use them wisely to make sure that there isn't resistance building up on pasture. So these doses have an incredibly high kill rate. They don't have an 100% kill rate. But they do have a pretty as good as it gets, really. And unfortunately, because of sort of inappropriate misuse of these doses on farms, in those farms that we were saying had triple resistance to white, yellow and clear dose already, when they've sort of felt like they have no other option, some of these farms across the UK have already started using these doses as sort of more of a routine thing. And there is already resistance proven to orange classes of drench already, which is pretty shocking, really, because I say after you've kind of gone through these doses, there is nowhere else to go. There's no alternative. And we have to be careful about how we use these doses to make sure that they're there for the future, really, because they're not something that can just be sort of slipped into the use of a regular dose like the other ones have been in the past. So yes, used in the right manner, these doses can be very effective. They can help reduce the number of resistant worms in your grazing lambs, which will then have a knock-on effect on the pasture. Can help reduce the amount of resistance building up on pasture, so slow that exponential growth of resistant worms on pasture. And obviously, used in the right way as well, they can also have a really good effect on your lambs. They'll clear out a lot of worms and help them to fatten and improve quicker. And the idea being you hopefully won't need to keep dosing them for too long after they've had one of these doses. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second as to when we actually use them properly. So yes, good drench practices always apply when using these doses, and really there are only two scenarios where we actually advocate using these doses, and they are basically as a break dose and as a quarantine dose, and we'll go through these in a little bit more detail in a second. But so just to reiterate why it matters when we give these doses, again, just going back to how resistance builds up, if you give these doses too often, so if you slot like using orange or purple doses into your regular sort of dosing regime and just use them continually throughout the grazing season and just use them really regularly, so you say every 4 to 6 weeks, it's exactly like we were saying earlier, where the worms are having the same method of attack every single time, which means they are going to get clever, and if they're going to become elite worms, which is where you get this resistance build up. And so if we use them like that, that's how that's going to happen. And the other reason, a lot of farmers will say, if this worm dose has got such a good kill rate, why can't I just use it as my first dose or really early on in the season, and that'll get all those worms gone and my lambs will fatten really quickly? Well, the problem with that is we need to make sure when we give these doses that we give them when there is already a good population of worms on the pasture. So kind of when we refer to when we do these as a break dose, well, it tends to be when we advise to give that at the sort of late grazing season. And the reason for this is because we have to make sure that any resistant worm eggs to these orange and purple classes, if they're getting kicked out onto pasture, that they're going to get well diluted by the pasture population of worms. So you have to make sure that you give them when the pasture population is reasonably high, because if you give them when the pasture population is low and there's resistant worm eggs going out onto the pasture, the chances of two resistant worms meeting and then multiplying in lamb's guts is going to be a lot higher. So you're going to get a very quick and rapid development of resistance to these doses on farm. So it's really important to make sure that you do give them at the correct time and when we advise. So as a break dose, as I say, just to reiterate, we tend to say this is basically when you give lambs a dose late in the grazing season, and the idea being that it clears out all those gut worms that are resistant to your yellow, clear and white doses. It clears them all out, which means it gives the lambs a great sort of finish, if you like. They're going to finish really quickly. They hopefully won't need dosing again with any wormers after that. And then, as I said, what that then does is it clears out all those resistant worm eggs for those to the yellow, clear and white doses. So those aren't then getting kicked out into pasture year after year. So that will then basically lower the rate of resistance development to those other doses on pasture. So basically these orange and purple doses can help to preserve the use of your other doses on pasture for years to come if you use them in the correct way like this. So just to reiterate what we've just said there with this nice slide. So this is just talking about your general treatment of worms in lambs as you go through the grazing season. So you obviously use your first dose for nematodirus would always be still your white dose, because there's very little resistance to nematodirus for white dose. So it's still very effective on farms. So the majority of worms we've been talking about here in this talk tonight is going to be targeting your roundworms, and nematodirus are obviously a different group of worms, and they're sort of a separate entity, if you like. And it's important to note that there's very little resistance in nematodirus to white dose, so it's still effective as a first dose, and it should still be actively encouraged, because it's you don't want to be going in it and treating with your other classes of dose for nematodirus, because it's still very easily treated by your white dose, and we need to use it where we can and use it wisely. So in your second dose or your third dose might be a group, so a clear dose or a yellow dose there, and then your last dose there, hopefully late summer in your late grazing season, would be a purple or an orange dose of wormer, and so that will then basically clear out all of those resistant worms. You can see in the diagram above there with the sheep. Clear out all those resistant worms, give them a really good clear out, if you like, and hopefully help them fatten really quickly. And ideally, you want to put those lambs back onto dirty pasture, so back onto the pasture they were on before for about 4 to 5 days before you consider them moving them. And so the idea being that then any resistant worms that do get kicked out are going to get diluted by the high high pasture burden of worms. So quarantine dosing. So this is the second example of when we would be using your purple and your orange doses. So every time you buy something in, you're essentially also buying in a bucket load of worms. And those worms, you have no idea because you don't know the grazing history of those animals that you've bought in. You don't know whether those worms are resistant to any of the classes of dose. So you could be buying in a whole belly full of resistant worms as well. And, if you're just talking about the odd ram here and there, you're probably not going to have a very significant effect, but it's still going to be enough of an effect to worry about. And certainly if you're thinking about buying in ewe lambs or something like that, or a good crop of animals, then, buying in sort of 50 ewe lambs or something, and they've got resistant worms in their stomachs, and that could basically be disastrous for your flock and your pasture, your refugia population going forward. And it's important to remember as well that incoming stock, so you might think it's just your purchased animals. It's important to remember if you've got any ewe lambs going off for wintering, for fattening over wintering or something like that, or ram lambs, those are essentially then classed as incoming stock when they come home, because they've been away, they've been grazing somebody else's pasture, so they've been picking up somebody else's pasture, so refugia population, so somebody else's worms, because they've been grazing that pasture and picking up the burden off the pasture. So as I said, when they come home, you need to think about giving them a quarantine dose as well. The idea being that if you use these orange and purple classes, then it gives them a really good clear out. It gets any worms that are resistant out of their stomachs, so any resistance to the white, yellow or clear dose, it clears them out. And if you leave them on hand standing for sort of 24, 48 hours, it allows them to kick out any resistant worms as well. So the idea being that when they then go on to pasture, that they are then clean and they're not going to bring you in any problems. And ideally, they would then be isolated on a dirty pasture for 2-3 weeks, or 3 weeks, 21 days for your isolation period before mixing with other stock. So there, here we go. So this is the same diagram as the previous one, but demonstrating where we'd use our quarantine dose. So this is some animals arriving on farm, and they've got resistant worms in their stomach, hypothetically. You then treat them with your orange or your purple dose, leave them on hard standing for 24 to 48 hours, and then you return them to a dirty pasture for about 3 weeks. And say, just make sure that they've got a good clear out. So just to summarize, so using orange and purple doses can massively help improve the flock performance, as well as preserving the longevity and the ability to use these doses, so your white, yellow and clear doses going forward, because as I say, you can use them wisely to help manage the build-up of resistance on pasture. But it's really important to make sure you only use these doses when they should be used. And I say that's as a break dose or as a quarantine dose. And if you start using them as regular doses, you are going to walk into problems. And then really after that, as I said, because there's not anything else really sort of in the development process. I mean, they're obviously always looking to develop new doses, but there's nothing been developed for the last 10 years. If you get resistance to these top classes of wormer, you really are very stuck of where to go after that. So it's really important to work with your vet, develop a strategic drenching protocol with your other classes of dose, get your dose timings right, make sure you're doing your parasite control and parasite diagnostics, so doing your fecal load counting, doing your regular monitoring of your daily live weight gain, and making sure that you're using your anthelmintics responsibly, and slotting these doses into a good drenching program at the right time. And your vet can also help you, to establish your current resistance levels on farm as well. So making sure that you're asking them to help, if you want to know how bad your resistance problems are to your white, yellow or clear doses, knowledge is key. And at the end of the day, if you know what your resistance levels are on farm, it gives you a lot more to work with going forward in terms of knowing sort of how long you might have with these doses and how careful you have to be. So doing some fecal egg reduction testing with your vet could be something that you could do this summer. It's probably something we'd recommend over the summer grazing period. And so looking forward now over this grazing period, it would be something you could talk to your vet about now, get a plan in place for the summer. And as I say, it's very quick and it's very easy. It just requires a crop of lambs and some doses and some poo bags, and that's pretty much it really. So yeah, it's something that you can do quite easily, and it's something definitely to get involved with your vet to do. There we go. And these are some good references here. So these are some good websites that you can refer to. Scops is an excellent website in terms of explaining and clarifying some of the issues we talked about tonight. Resistance can be something that's really difficult to get your head around. And I'm sorry if I have confused matters for anybody. I'm happy to stay on and try and explain anything at the end if it's not 100% clear. But yeah, these websites here, though, are excellent at trying to kind of explain things, and they're really a good website to refer to try to get some clarity on some of the things we discussed tonight. And that's me, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Claire. There was just one other reference I will add to that list, which is the new booklet that has just come out, which is a really good reference. It's got a lot of information in it. And thank you very much, because you used 2 slides that were actually taken from the centre of the booklet about how when to use the group 4 and group 5 drugs. And obviously using all the other different tools in the armoury, which brings me on to just have a quick look. Thank you all very much for taking part in the poll. We've got nearly 70% of you taking part who actually do use fecal egg counting already to help manage the worm control on your farm. And also a fair few of you weighing lambs, both to calculate dose and to calculate live weight gain. And it's really good to see some of you using the SCOPS forecast. So it does help you to plan your strategy. And then the other tools, they're all being used, like using the group 4 and 5 strategically, and also looking at clean, safe grazing systems, so that where there is less risk. And then just 1 or 2 of you branching into use of alternative forages. So again, thank you very much for taking part in the poll. I will please do continue to submit questions in the Q&A. We will come to all those questions at the end of the presentation, which we're about to hear from Sion. So I will hand over to Sion now.
Yep, diolch yn fawr, Heather. Nos ydych chi gyd. Thank you very much, Heather. Good evening to you all. Just to give you a brief background, I think there'll be a video loop going up in a minute. Just to give you a bit of a background of what we do here. So I'm in partnership with my wife and my mother and father-in-law here at Bryn Uchaf. We're in a village called Llanymowddwy, which is between Machynlleth and Dolgellau. We're kind of north of mid Wales, if you like. You'd classify Bryn Uchaf as a mountain farm, and we run about 650 ewes, and 220 ewe lamb replacements are kept every year. 350 Welsh ewes are put back to the Welsh ram on the mountain, and then 100 Welsh ewes go to the Aberfield, and then we keep about 200 Aberfield cross, mainly Aberfield crossbred ewes then. And we're all outdoor lambing, bar some triplets. We try and be a closed flock. We don't buy any ewes or ewe lambs, but we do buy rams in, and we do follow the quarantine procedures Claire mentioned earlier. We've got about 15 suckler cows. We've got into a system now of buying in-calf stabiliser heifers and then putting a Charolais bull back onto them then, with the aim of possibly increasing them a little bit as we go on, really. There's a little bit of a background for you. Back 2 years ago now, we became part of the Stoc Plus project delivered by HCC, and one of the first aims we had from that was to address our worm control. Probably been guilty in the past of going in blind, drenching lambs without actually knowing if they need doing, or based on timings during the year, or being that they were in anyway, we'll do them. This kind of led to for me looking at the Techion fecal egg counting facility, and you might see on that slide, so the kit that Techion provide, we pay a subscription to them annually, and then I basically go out. I usually start about the second week of May, depends on the nematode iris forecast, but we'll start around then and go out and take samples. It isn't the easiest job with ewes and lambs. Try and go fairly early in the morning and catch them, and to get a decent sample of different batches of lambs, and then I come back into the house, create the sample through the kit that's on the facility, and then we basically send a photo of the fecal egg count to Techion, and they will then send back the result then of what the fecal egg count is, what the strong egg count is, and what the nematode iris count is, and it'll give us a total of the fecal egg count then as well. So although there's a cost to it, it's a very, very handy service. The trouble with it probably that I don't use enough of it, but I'm trying to get into the system of using more and more of it. We tend to be in a system where we produce lambs. If we've got lambs at about 30 kilos, sorry, the phone's going now. I'll just have, if we've got lambs going at about 30 kilos, we'll probably send them off in early July, really, if they're fit and ready, and then we'll probably keep on to heavier weights later on in the season, really. As part of the Stoc Plus project, we this last year we went in with the break dose of the Group 4. We thought it'd be a good idea with some of the Welsh tup lambs we kept. That'd be give them a break, and it'd help to get them off sooner. We managed to. That was the last drench that those lambs had for that season, really, bar the ewe lambs, and it worked fairly well. It did do what it lowered the count. I was following it up with different timings and different fecal egg counts, and it looked to have done the job. With quarantine, I mentioned earlier about the rams we buy in. Every ram that comes here is quarantined, ideally as long as possible, really. Not just for the worming, but for feed issues and stuff like that. It's a bit difficult with Welsh mountain rams because they're fairly close to tupping time, the sales, but they are put in, and then we give them we give them the Group 4 dose, as well as a scab treatment and fluke and various other things as well, really, to get them going and to get them, make sure that we don't buy any resistant worms onto the holding if we can, really. Another thing we try and avoid to do now is kind of when we do decide when we have the information and that the count is enough to go in with a drench for lambs, we don't turn them onto clean pasture. We'll turn them back onto where they've been for at least 24 hours before they moved on to somewhere new, just to get into that previously we'd always dosed and then put them onto new hay or aftermath or just a clean pasture. But we've stopped doing that, really, and I think that's had a good effect as well, really. We'll be tagging lambs a bit earlier than usual this year for two reasons. We're part of the HCC Hill Ram project, so there'll be tags going into the lambs that are in that job, but we'll also be tagging some crossbreds as well around in the next fortnight or so, with the aim of establishing a daily live weight gain, not just of group of lambs, but of individuals, so we can hopefully be able to find out what lambs are doing what, and when we're looking at not drenching a whole group or looking at that 5 to 10% that don't need drenching, we'll have the daily live weight gain figure on a handheld recorder to tell me what it is. So if I see a lamb that is doing between 250 and 300 grams a day, physically looking well, handling well, you would question why that would need to be done. But if the group fecal egg count is around 380 to 400, I'm obviously going to need to think about doing something. But it's something from an individual perspective. It's a way of, again, making sure that the groups of drenches that are available still work here, really. We'll be doing the efficacy tests this year through Farming Connect, so we'll have a good understanding of what actually works and what doesn't. I suspect we have resistance to the I'm fairly certain we have to the white drench, not like a lot of other places, but I have my doubts about the Group 2 as well, really, based on some kind of testing I've done myself really, but there wasn't a lot of detail to it, but we will see when we do the proper stuff later on in the year. Claire mentioned about wintering and bringing back stock. And our system is, because we don't house any sheep, we tend to be very reliant on winter grazing. We've come across, last 3 years we've come across an arable farm not too far from here really, about an hour and a half, 2 hours, where all the ewe lambs go. And this year, all the twins went there as well on stubble turnips. Worked out fairly well really, but because it's an arable farm, no other sheep go there. There aren't any cattle there, so the turnips are put in a rotation that they've got. And we're very, very fortunate in that sense. It's kept separate from everywhere else. It's all electric fenced and stuff, but it is one way of making sure that we probably get away with it. Probably Claire will give me a row for saying, but we get out because it's an arable place with no other sheep there. We get away with not having to quarantine and treat when they come home. Where previously we've had places where possibly we've shared with someone else, so you don't really know what the burdens they have or what resistance issues they have really. And we've been guilty of not doing anything when they come home really, where they come home and they go straight to the mountain. There's also, because we're a mountain farm, it's a fairly extensive system on the mountain, and the actual worm burdens on the lambs is very, very low through the season really. Having said that, there's nothing like a bit of a disaster to get you thinking about things really. And again, about 3 or 4 years ago, we brought ewes down from the mountain in early September, and there was a fluke burden on them and a very, very high worm burden as well. So that just kept things in check, and then we've kept a close eye on things like that as we go on. So after we wean the ewe lambs off the mountain a lot sooner than we used to try and get those ewes back into a better condition. And we do a fecal egg count on those ewes as well in very early autumn, and then if we got poorer ones we keep down, we just keep a check on them to see if they need doing. But generally we won't go in with a wormer in the spring for ewes at all really, and we haven't done for quite a few years now really. But again, it's something, if they need doing we will do, but it's we tend not to have that problem at the minute really. So I think that covers really some of the stuff we've been doing. It's it's nothing groundbreaking really, but it's just getting into that pattern of doing things that are we probably haven't done before. The weighing before the drenching, and the actual measuring of the drenching gun. We have seen variations in measurements kind of halfway through a treatment. Got to watch out with these guns, and they're not the most consistent things really. But we try and get a grip of it before we start, and kind of halfway through as well. And it's a job not to rush through it as well, and make sure they all get when you the ones that you are going to do, that they all get the right amount. If something is spitted out, well go back and try again. I think it's worth just spending an extra hour on the job really than rushing through it and getting the job half done really. So that's just a little bit of a background of what we've done, but we find it very, very beneficial really through having Claire as our Stoc Plus vet and using the Sion facility. We can get the results back in it depends how we time it. If it's in the evening, this time of night, I can do it now this evening, and there'll be someone in New Zealand reading it, and they could send me. So by next morning, by tomorrow morning, I'd know if we need to do anything with them really. So it's kind of working a way around doing it like that. I think I've covered a lot of the things I was going to mention really. So if I'm sure there'll be some questions afterwards. Okay, diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Okay, Diolch. Thank you very much, Sean. That's ideal. To hear firsthand from a practical farmer about the changes you've made, and how you're making a difference is ideal. We have had quite a lot of questions. I'm going to just focus on, and we'll come back to Sean because there is going to be one for you, but if we just go to the purple and orange, we've had one question in saying, with purple and orange wormers, do you dose all the lambs, or do you leave the top 5 to 10%?
So yeah, you still want to make sure that you're dosing just leaving the top 5 to 10%, so not blanket treating even when you're using an orange and purple dose, and the idea being that basically, although you might think, oh yeah, but you're leaving some of that population exposed, you're trying to minimize the effect or the chances of selecting too much for worms that are resistant to orange and purple drenches. So basically, if you blanket treat, the only worms that are going to get chucked out onto the pasture from that gang of animals are going to be resistant worms to orange and purple doses. So the idea being that if you leave the top 5 to 10% untreated, then you're going to get a mixture of worms, so some that are not exposed being kicked out into the pasture as well. So it's just basically about trying to dilute out the effect of those resistant worms hitting the pasture. So if you can dose and leave the top 5 to 10% of the lambs, then you're essentially minimising the chances of your resistant worms to orange and purple doses having a big effect on the pasture population.
Ideal. Thank you very much, Claire. I mean, we've been talking about purple and orange, and some of the questions have come in as trade names. There are really only 2 trade names. Could you just clarify which is which for everybody?
So usually orange is Zolvix and purple is Startec.
Thank you very much. So we've had a question here about someone using Zolvix as a quarantine drench for purchasing rams. And they also use Zolvix at the end of the season for their replacement ewe lambs. Okay. The question is, should they be introducing purple Startec, into their protocol or not? And how do the group 4 and 5 products actually differ?
So Startec is a dual product. So Startec is the purple class, and that is actually a dual product. So it's basically 2 products that work together. So it's supposed to be, it works in a very different way to Zolvix, which is just a one product. So basically the idea being that you're less likely, well, it's supposed to be sort of the top end one. It's slightly marginally pips Zolvix to the post, I think, in terms of the kill rate of worms. But I mean, Zolvix is incredibly effective and it is a good dose. I wouldn't know whether or not you would benefit hugely from using sort of, an orange and then a purple in those 2 different scenarios. You probably could, but I would say that probably you wouldn't necessarily need to, as long as you're using Zolvix appropriately. It might be sort of more wise to perhaps spare your Startec until, in case you need to use that in the future. And also, I think Startec is also, I don't know if it is now, but it certainly was more difficult to get hold of compared to Zolvix. Certainly, we were finding as a veterinary practice, we had more issues getting hold of Startec compared to Zolvix. And I think cost-wise as well, it's slightly more expensive, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. But I think in terms of availability, Zolvix tends to be a lot more widely available. But yeah, I mean, I think there's pros and minuses to that. You probably could use one at one point of the year and one at the other point, because you are essentially, rotating your drenches there. But in terms of, because there's so little resistance, I think as long as you're using these doses wisely, and you're not using them too frequently throughout each other. Perhaps you could alternate it year after, like 1 year, and then the other year you could use a different product. But I think because there's so little resistance to these ones, you should be okay.
Great, thank you very much. You've just also, there was another question about when we might expect to see purple drenches commercially available in the UK, and I think you've already alluded to that issue.
It's difficult at the moment.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't know if we have any more up to date on that. A question has also come in, and I think this is fecal samples, and maybe we'll start with Sion on this one. How often do you collect fecal samples?
We try and get it done now in early May. It all depends. I'm at fault sometimes. I probably don't do it enough, but we try and go. I'll try and go once a week if I can. And the trouble I do get with it is when I go and take the sample, if the sample comes back that it's say 140 eggs per gram, I think, oh, they're all right. And then the danger is in a couple of days it could be a lot higher. So you got to keep an eye on things really. The more I use it, the more I use of the facility, the better information I've got then really. So May, June, July is the main. Well, May and June really is the main time I use it. But when we've weaned then in early July, it's a bit easier to do. So every time the lambs are in, I'll take a sample, and it's a lot easier then because you're handling them more often. So they're done quite a bit then really. We try. A lot of our lambs will be gone by end of October, November. We're not. We'll sell quite a few stores at the end of the season really, just to try and get some grass for the early end of the following year. But that's our main time really. But I need to be doing, we do tests on the ewes late summer, early autumn, just to make sure that everything's all right. We haven't done any pre-lambing, which a lot of people are doing, and is probably something I should be doing a bit more of really. It's a little bit difficult if there quite a few of them are away on wintering, but we still have got some at home here, so it's something we probably look at doing next season really.
Great, thank you very much, Sean. Claire, would you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, I think Sean's actually pretty on the ball there, doing it every week with some of the lambs. Like, I think that you'd be hard pushed. I think you probably have the massive advantage in that you've got the home kit, which, when you've got it, you may as well use it, because ultimately knowledge is key. And as you say, things can change very quickly. But I think in terms of, trying to advise farmers, especially if they're having to bring samples into the vets, which most of them are, to then either have them run in the vets or sent off, monthly is usually more than adequate in terms of running your fecal egg count samples on lambs through the grazing season. We tend to say if you can try and do it monthly, that'll give you a relatively good idea. The important thing is to make sure that you are not just taking a poo sample out of a gang of lambs and assuming that's the blanket value for all of your lambs, because you've got to remember that you've obviously got fields of twins versus fields of triplets and maybe and singles as well, and they're all going to have a different worm burden, because basically the amount of stress on them is going to have a play on how well they handle the worm burdens and how sort of affected they are by it. But also, if they're a set of twins, they're going to be grazing more, so they're going to be picking up more worm eggs as well. So it's really important to make sure that you are collecting samples from your different gangs of lambs as well. So making sure you split them and not just taking one sample from a gang of lambs and assuming that gives you an answer for the whole crop of lambs for that year. So it's important to make sure that you split it down into twins and singles, and also your different pastures as well, because again, they're going to have different burdens depending on what's grazed there previously or what's grazing there with them, or the pasture type as well. So it sort of can be quite complicated, but yeah, essentially monthly in terms of timing for how often, but making sure you're running multiple samples to make sure you're getting a good idea and giving you more of an informed choice as to who you can get away with treating and who you might be able to leave for a little bit longer. But yeah, Sean's right, weekly would be lovely if you could do it, but it probably would put a lot of farmers off, I think, if we said that they had to bring samples in weekly to sort of have them sent off and tested. Yeah, if you've got the kit at home, then as often as you can use it, it would be great. It gives you much more idea in terms of close monitoring really, and getting your timing spot on.
Brilliant, thank you. And another kind of relevant question that sort of links to that. In your presentation, you mentioned measuring live weight gain, and that should we be setting a target for live weight gain, and how do you decide who to do? How do you use live weight gain alongside fecal egg counting, I think is the question.
Okay. It's always a difficult one, that one. I mean, you get some farms that will kind of measure daily live weight gain on a regular basis. They weigh every couple of weeks, and they can then use that to work out how much the lambs are gaining and look at the kind of trends. And that can basically be used alongside your fecal egg counting in terms of giving you an idea on when lambs are starting to struggle. So when your daily live weight gain is starting to plateau or even starting to decline, that might then give you an indication that you then need to go in and do a fecal egg count to confirm whether there's a worm burden there. Or some farmers will just dose based off daily live weight gain, because especially if they're getting clinical signs as well, then it gives them an idea idea, and it's something that they can monitor going forward. And in terms of setting targets, I can't really give you a value for everyone should be aiming for this amount per day, because everything is going to vary in terms of your setup, your farming style, your breeds. But the AHDB booklet on managing lamb growth, I've referenced it at the end of my my presentation. That's actually got a link. It's got a table in there for sort of your target daily live weight gain. That can be very useful to look at. But really, I think, you know, a lot of farms will sort of say, you know, they don't like the idea of benchmarking, and especially the only thing I find about that booklet is it can be a little bit restrictive in terms of giving you something to go on for your hill farms. It doesn't necessarily give you a value for your hill farmers and the lambs that are kind of grazing on hill pasture and mountain land. And I think with those, you probably have to sort of monitor your daily live weight gain year on year and compare it to previous years, and sort of you know, compare it in terms of, you know, your farm performance and your lamb's performance year on year, depending on, you know, how you should be performing compared to the previous years. And there's also sort of farmers groups as well, which will give you an idea, like if anyone's involved in sort of flock clubs and that kind of thing with their vet practice, that can give you an idea as well in terms of comparing with other farmers. But yeah, it's difficult to put a value on what you should be aiming for, and because everyone's different sort of management type and farm type and breed type is going to change the game.
Yeah, thank you. And I suppose also, if you are monitoring live weight gain, if you see a drop on your farm, you know, it's a real wake up call, isn't it? So yeah. No, thank you for that. So just moving on, this is another very interesting question actually from a RAMA or an SQP who wants to know for Claire and Sean, what started the vet farmer relationship to discuss. It says worming protocols, but it's actually the strategy to control worms across the farm, isn't it? That you've done together. So what you know, what started the relationship, and how would you suggest it's to encourage farmers to engage, say, with RAMAs or SQPs and vets? Is there any tips you've got on that?
I think Sean and I sort of started working together. It was when the flock club started, wasn't it, Sean? Probably. So I started the flock club in our practice about 4 years ago. And so Sean signed up and I was Sean's vet then through that. And that's how we started working together. But I would say probably it kind of kicked off because that was round about the time you said you had those ewes that came down from the mountain, didn't you? And we, you know, it started off by a problem, really, wasn't it? But that's basically how we started sort of working together the most. And yeah, we started doing some diagnostics then, really, didn't we? We started looking at why those ewes were not performing. Did some poo samples and some blood samples as well, didn't we?
Yeah. There's nothing like a disaster to get you to focus.
To kick off the relationship.
it had an effect on that year's crop of lambs, or the next year's crop of lambs, because, you know, they had conditioned to gain back the ewes and they didn't quite do it, and it was a year to forget, really. So I you know, we don't want to be going down that route again. So yeah, so this is why we do we have, you know, quite often discussions through the Flock Health Club and the Stoc Plus project, really, to prevent that. And, you know, things are looking a bit, you know, moving in the right direction.
They've certainly, we've just done a review recently, haven't we? And it's just sort of it's quite interesting, wasn't it? Everything seems to be coming together and it's really performing well this year, isn't it? This was like the first year you said, you know, scanning results were really good and the ewes are looking awesome. It's sort of come round a nice cycle now, hasn't it?
Yes, but not to get too, you know, you've got to keep an eye on stuff, and
yeah,
it could be a different story next September if, you know, if we haven't used all this stuff, and yeah, just keep an eye on things, really.
Oh, no, great, good answer, thank you. And that's where sort of planning ahead and just generally health planning is obviously helping both of those issues, isn't it? We're nearly sort of coming to the end, but another couple of questions. There's another one here about nematodirus. Any tips on any thoughts on nematodirus this spring? Obviously, we're talking about worm control generally, but now is a time for sort of planning. Any thoughts on that, please, Claire?
So I think at the moment, the last time I checked the sort of the NADLIS forecaster for the nematovirus risk in Wales, at the moment it's still sort of low to, I think there's 1 or 2 little areas near the border that are starting to come into medium risk, but I think the majority of Wales is still in low risk, and that's because we've obviously had such a dry spell. And usually your nematovirus is that worm that lives on the pasture, or the eggs survive on the pasture over the winter. And then usually you're watching out for sort of springtime, you're watching out for that mass hatch effect, as we call it. And that's basically when you get a period of frost that's then sort of followed by a milder period, about a week of warmer weather. And then you get that mass hatch of those worm eggs that have been surviving on the pasture. And then you get those high nematovirus numbers about a week later. And that's when you can get your lambs sort of suddenly going down with nematovirus. But obviously this year has been really, really different, because the weather's just been so up and down, so it's been very unpredictable. So at the moment, we haven't seen any nematovirus really in significant numbers anywhere in Wales. But as I said, we are starting to see indications that it might be on its way soon. As they're looking at the weather pattern, you can also get nematovirus peak hatch sort of when you get a period of a very dry spell as well, followed by again a muggy wet period. And looking at the weather forecast, obviously we've had a spell of about 3 weeks of no rain, so it's been very, very dry. So we've had that kind of drying effect that you know is mimicked by the frost that you used to see kind of this time of year. And then we're about to get a wetter, sort of milder period. So I wouldn't be surprised if in about a week, 10 days, I think the weather's supposed to break tomorrow, in about a week, 10 days, we're starting to see nematovirus on the pasture start to creep up again. So I think it would be interesting to see kind of what happens to the parasite forecaster then, but I would imagine that we are going to be starting to see nematovirus in the next couple of weeks. So it's definitely something to keep an eye out for. And I say white dose is the dose you want to be going in with to treat for nematovirus, because there's still so little resistance. It's very effective. But your vet can advise you about that one.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Just one more, maybe 2 more. One question here. Can I give lambs a worm drench at the same time as I give them a vaccination?
So it depends on the vaccine. Heptavac P can be a little bit, as long as the lambs are healthy, you know, everything should be fine. But with Heptavac P, it is quite a harsh injection in that it's obviously a lot of the strains are clostridial plus the Pasteurella component as well. So it does put a little bit of stress and strain on them. So I think probably I'd have to check the data sheet, but most likely, although it is safe, there is the element of the stress on the body, and it might knock them quite a bit, especially if you know, there is sort of maybe a very low level of Pasteurella pneumonia sort of perhaps sort of creeping in. If you then hit them with a drench as well, it potentially could knock them over the edge. So I think probably with my vet hat on, I would probably say it's wise to leave about a couple of weeks, well, a week, depends on what you can get away with the drenching interval, but try to leave a bit of an interval, perhaps a week, in terms of between the two, just to avoid stressing the body really and giving them too much of a check. But in theory, in principle, there shouldn't be actually any interaction with the actual products you're using. It's just in terms of the stress, you might potentially find if you're using something like Heptavac P, there'd be a little bit more of a check on them. However, if you're going with something like Bravoxin or Covaxin, those vaccines aren't too heavy hitting on the body because there isn't a Pasteurella cover as well. So you'd probably be a bit safer using those. But with Heptavac P, I would always advise being a little bit more cautious with lambs and heavily pregnant sheep as well, just because, it is a little bit of a stronger dose. A stronger vaccine, sorry.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. I think we've really come to the end, running out of time now. If your question hasn't been answered, we will be answering it in the Q&A, and we will be getting back to you. But I think now I'd just really like to thank Sion and Claire very much indeed for the contributions tonight. It's been really useful, lots of questions, really interesting. I would encourage you all to take a look at our new booklet, because it is, you can use it as a reference. I don't expect you to read it from cover to cover, but there's a lot of information in there which should be useful for the coming months, to help you control your worms in your sheep. At the end of this webinar, there will be a feedback questions, and we really appreciate it if you would take the time just to fill it in. It helps us plan what we do next, and it'd be very, very helpful. So without any more ado, I think I'd just like again to say diolch yn fawr to Sion, and thank you very, very much to Claire, and look out for our next webinar.